And now here's Module D. And Module D is the last in the series of our modules on accessible environments and especially on APS. So in Module D, we're going to talk about some of the features of the APS, a little bit about the current technology, the guidelines, and the usage. And this is really important because you'll be working with traffic engineers, and it's important for you to understand the differences between different types and be able to speak their language. So let's begin. Very important that the APS is installed properly because it really affects whether or not the individual is going to be able to make good use of it. Oftentimes what we're seeing these days is that intersections are being retrofitted. And we want to make sure that when they are retrofitted, that the most usable equipment is put into place. We want an APS that fits the characteristics of the person's needs and of the environment. Now, of course, there's certain information we all know is provided by the APS. Let's review it quickly. It provides an audible and in some cases a vibrotactile indication that the signal has changed of the walk phase. It explains, or not explains, but it provides information that lets us know where the push button is from the locator tone. As we approach the opposite corner during the crossing, oftentimes we can hear the locator tone on the other side, which is helpful. Sometimes the devices have diagrams that tell us something about the geometry of the intersection, the street names, and sometimes even information through a tactile arrow or some other audible information that gives us information about the crosswalk itself. Now, there are various types of pedestrian signals that are available and that are in use across the United States and elsewhere. There's the ped head mounted, which is in the ped head on the pole, much higher up. There's the push button integrated, which is right there by the push button. There's a receiver based, where an individual holds a receiver. I've seen very few of those. There's vibrotactile only, which is useful for somebody who's deafblind. And there's a combination of ped head and push button information, which is sometimes in use as well. So the ped head mounted is the most common type in the United States. And the sound comes from a speaker that's mounted on or in the pedestrian signal head on the pole up above. Typically there's a buzz, a tone, a bird call, something like that to tell the pedestrian that the walk phase has started. One of the problems, of course, is that there's no locator tone most often. We see this ourselves at times as we're traveling. The button is necessary to extend the pedestrian phase, but if you're not very familiar with that intersection, you don't know where the button is. Of course, if somebody travels regularly through that intersection, they know where that pole is and they can find it. So as we've mentioned before, oftentimes cuckoo will indicate north-south. The chirp indicates east-west. Sometimes there's confusion. People don't realize that, and we have to teach that to our students. I've mentioned before that it's possible to gain alignment by using the sound of the APS on the opposite side of the street as you're crossing the street. Sometimes that works, sometimes that does not work. When it doesn't work, sometimes it's because there are tall buildings around, the sound bounces, it's hard to localize where that sound is. Sometimes the sound that's on that far side is masked by the sound of the signal as the person's leaving the corner the corner from which they're departing. However, when they get halfway across the street, they can then begin to hear the sound from the pole across the way. And sometimes the sound of the APS itself is a problem because it can mask the sound of traffic. Now, with the push-button integrated APS, the speaker and the vibrating surface or the arrow is located at the button itself. And there's a locator tone that informs pedestrians that the button itself has to be pushed to bring on the pedestrian face. The push-button APS sound comes from that push-button housing. And the walk interval is indicated by usually the same tone as the indicator tone, but it's much faster. And or there could be a speech message, or there could be other tones. And here's a couple common types of push-button integrated systems. I think the one on the left is probably more common than the one on the right. Notice the one on the right, on the side, there's an orange strip, and that gives indication about the actual intersection. And that can be very helpful. I've seen some of those out west. In the case of an APS that uses speech, oftentimes it'll give information about the street that somebody is to cross, and that's very helpful. Some visually impaired people report that they wait to hear the name, and so they lose their timing. Whereas with a repetitive tone, they're not waiting for anything. They're ready to go, and they're making their crossing. So there's advantages and disadvantages. But generally speaking, they're helpful. So typically, the walk indication comes from a speaker that's mounted on the pad head. The speaker may be aimed down in a position so the individual can hear it easily. And the tone comes from a separate speaker, if it's pad head mounted. But it's high. And so you can see here exactly where that speaker is located. Now, those that are vibrotactile only, they have to be located very precisely at the place where somebody's leaving the curb for them to be useful, because the person has to be there waiting for the signal to change and can't be far off and then have to get to the corner. And the person has to have their hand on the button to recognize that the light has changed. The actual location of the vibrating surface depends on the APS signal manufacturer. So, some of the features with audible and vibrotactile, they identify sometimes a specific crosswalk, sometimes they always identify the start of the walk phase. The tactile arrow is aligned in the direction of travel on the sidewalk or on the crosswalk. So that arrow is very important. It actually shows which button controls your crossing. The push button locator tone provides information about its location. If it's in that push button box, the sound is coming from where that push button is. What we should have is one tone per second. It should be loud enough to be heard from 6 to 12 feet away. And it should be less than 0.15 seconds in duration. I have from time to time heard of complaints from people in the neighborhood where the sound is too loud and where it disturbs other people who live in that neighborhood, or if it's near a hospital and it's very, very loud, it can be disturbing. And sometimes they will tone them down, but sometimes they can get to be too soft. And there are systems that respond to ambient sound, so that at times when it's very loud, they get louder, and if it's soft, they get softer. Now the tactile arrow, it's a raised arrow and it should be aligned with the direction of the crosswalk of the street that the person is trying to cross. And the arrow could be on the push button or it could be part of the device, sometimes above the push button. And the arrow is the part that vibrates during the walk interval on some of the devices. So a vibrating surface, an arrow that vibrates, for example, is helpful to somebody who has a hearing loss and a visual loss. And it's also helpful if the sounds of the traffic are just too loud. It's something that then can be felt rather than heard. And it could be a part of the push button or it could be on the housing, but not actually the button itself. Here's an example of one. As I've mentioned, there is automatic volume adjustment on some of them, so that if the noise is high, the device, through its own microphone, senses that and will produce a louder sound. Some manufacturers provide signage on the button that is in Braille, and that can help by providing the street name, and it can help with choosing the correct push button as well. I don't see that as often. As I mentioned earlier, on the side of some of the devices, there can be a crosswalk map. And the symbols on this picture, for example, from the bottom of the picture, the down curb, a bike lane, 2 lanes of cars, an island, a rail line, 2 lanes of cars again, and then an up curb. So once you learn how to interpret that, that can be very useful, because otherwise you wouldn't have an indication of all that's in front of you if it's a brand new intersection. Now the tone alert. In some cases, it's a very brief burst of high-frequency sound to indicate the walk interval. At other times, it's just a more rapid, continuous sound of the same sound. Where it's a burst of high frequency, that really does help with very noisy environments. And typically, if there's a speech message, it won't say, "Time to cross now." And that's a liability issue, because if somebody would cross based on that and get hurt, the city would be liable. So instead, basically what they'll say is, Howard Street, for example, walk sign is on, is all it will say. And of course, we want to make sure that doesn't delay the person's ability to make a determination by listening to the complete message. But it does provide useful information. And oftentimes when a person is waiting for the crossing, it will say "wait to cross." And it provides the name of the street to be crossed. If the APS can't be separated by at least 10 feet, it must be located on the same pole. There can be some confusion, and so we have to be careful of this. The messages have to be really distinguishable for the different streets, or it becomes a problem. There are different ways of activating the buttons. Sometimes holding the button will give additional information. If it's held for 3 seconds, it can be used for different purposes. It can become a beaconing feature. It can provide more information. In some cases, it could provide longer crossing time. In some cases, there won't be an audible message unless the button is pressed for more than 3 seconds, but someone who knows the area will know this information because they've used it previously. Now, this idea of audible beaconing for alignment purposes. One of the guidelines from PROAC, which is also a report on APS, says that an audible beacon, a permanently fixed source emitting sound for directional orientation, it's the sound from the opposite side of the street, is used for directional guidance during a crossing. It can be provided for a single cycle when a pedestrian holds the push button in for a longer period of time. So that is a possibility. Not always successful, but certainly something that can be useful. It's not needed at all APS locations. It depends on the complexity of the intersection. So typically it's not put into place unless there's a request for it. Oftentimes it's used when there's a skewed sidewalk or really irregular geometry at the intersection, or if the crosswalk is really a long one, 70 feet, without a median in the middle, or somebody who has a severe problem could request it. It's not appropriate at all settings. So the MUTCD has certain specifications, and I think these are really important to note. The walk indication and the locator tone should be between 2 to 5 decibels above the ambient noise level. It should be audible within 6 to 12 feet of the push button. If it's audible much farther away, it's too loud. If you have to get much closer, you're going to have difficulty. There should be ambient volume adjustment if possible. That's not always the case, but that's the best. A tactile arrow aligned in the direction of the travel on the crosswalk is something that should be in place. And then the MUTCD, in regard to volume, it says the accessible walk signal tone should be no louder than the locator tone, except when there is optional activation to provide a louder signal for a single pedestrian phase. And under guidance, it says push buttons should be audibly locatable. Push button locator tone should be intensity responsive to ambient sound and be audible 1.8 to 3.7 meters or 6 to 12 feet from the push button, or to the building line, whichever is less. Push button locator tones should be no more than 5 decibels louder than ambient sound. So we have some pretty strict guidelines in regard to these systems. In regard to the push-button locator tone, also it says repeating sound that informs approaching pedestrians that they are required to push a button, enables visually impaired pedestrians to locate the push button, alerts pedestrians that there is a push button. If there's a tone, it should be a faster repetition rate than the locator tone. A verbal message for walk signal is termed walk sign and may be followed by the street name. And the vibrotactile devices should indicate the walk interval and indicate the direction for which the walk applies. Now, the location of the button, that's such a critical factor for students who are visually impaired. So let's pay close attention to this And I can give you regulations, but that doesn't mean that those regulations are always followed. So according to MUTCD, the push button location, adjacent to a level all-weather surface, I'll show you a picture in a moment. It should be on an accessible route to the curb ramp. It should be within 5 feet of the crosswalk extended, and I'll show a picture of that in a moment, and within 10 feet of the edge of the curb, shoulder, or pavement. So let's go to a couple of pictures. This is within 5 feet of the crosswalk extended. So this is the crosswalk line extended if we're crossing this way, and it should be within 5 feet. I wish that was always the case. And this is the all-weather area. And it should be within 10 feet of the curb if we're crossing this way, if we're going this way. That's ideal. Oftentimes we'll see older installations that bear no resemblance to this. But at least we know the ideal, and when you're advocating for the placement, it's something you should pay attention to. Okay, some general information. We've gone over some of this before. I'll go over it again. The APS information is supplemental to the traffic. Don't cross on the first walk interval. Maintain your alignment. Interpret the traffic. Make sure you understand whether there's an APS installed or not. Very basic information. The student should explore the APS and should kind of shift back and forth between the sound of the APS and the sound of the traffic, making sure that the tones or the speech do correspond with the traffic. There has to be a realignment, because after the person presses the button and returns to the predetermined spot to make a crossing, realignment has to take place. And in crossing, use the traffic to confirm that it's time to cross. Don't use the APS to tell you it's time to cross. APS tells you get ready. And you can use the locator tone on the destination corner for alignment. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And that's the information that I wanted to present on APS signals.